She drew her sick mother in a wheelchair, and everyone laughed, until a millionaire in a blue suit stood up, praised the picture, and changed all of their lives forever. The classroom was buzzing with restless energy, as if the children's laughter and whispers were trying to escape through the very walls. It was one of those afternoons when the sunlight streamed in diagonally through the tall windows, cutting golden shapes across the scratched desks. The teacher, Miss Turner, had given them a simple assignment, to draw something that meant the most to them, something close to their hearts. Pencils scratched, crayons broke in half, paper rustled, and the room became alive with both creativity and chaos. Some children were excitedly drawing superheroes, castles, or cars with exaggerated wheels. Others leaned over to copy their neighbors' ideas, snickering as they went along. At the very back sat Lisa, a small blonde girl with bright blue eyes and a yellow dress that seemed almost too cheerful for her shy and withdrawn demeanor. Her hair was neatly tied with a ribbon her mother had placed that morning, but by now a few strands had fallen into her face, framing her pale, serious expression. She bent low over the paper, pressing the crayon harder than she realized. Slowly, carefully, she traced the outline of a wheelchair, then the fragile figure of a woman sitting in it. Above the chair, she drew a red heart, not perfect or symmetrical, but pulsing with something real. For Lisa, this wasn't just art, it was confession. The moment she placed the paper at the edge of her desk, the boys in the next row caught sight of it. A sharp giggle escaped, then another, until it spread like wildfire. "What's that supposed to be?" one of them sneered. "Your princess? Or is it a robot on wheels?" The laughter grew louder, mixed with mocking imitations of squeaky wheels and exaggerated gasps of pity. A few girls covered their mouths as they laughed too, eager not to be left out. The sound of their mockery filled the room, bouncing off the chalkboard and echoing into Lisa's ears. Her fingers trembled as she tried to shield the drawing with her hands, but it was too late. She wanted to explain, to say that this wasn't just a figure in a chair, that it was her mother, the strongest person she knew, who had once danced across stages but now lived with pain in silence. Yet no words came out. Her throat tightened, her cheeks burned, and her eyes watered, though she forced herself not to cry. Crying would only give them more reason to laugh. Miss Turner clapped her hands to call the class to order, but even she couldn't entirely stop the giggles. Lisa lowered her head, wishing she could disappear into the floor. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she held on to the paper tightly, refusing to crumple it. It was all she had, her truth, her love, her way of showing the world that her mother, despite everything, was still the center of her universe. The laughter lingered like an echo, and though the noise eventually died down, the silence that followed was even heavier. Lisa sat frozen, staring at the drawing through her tears, while the rest of the children shifted impatiently, waiting for the next distraction to come along. At that moment, she felt smaller than ever, as if her voice had been stolen and hidden away where no one would ever hear it. Yet the heart on the paper seemed to beat quietly, stubbornly, reminding her that she had drawn it for love, not for approval. The laughter in the classroom had only just begun to fade when the heavy wooden door creaked open. Every head turned at once, and the air seemed to shift as if something important had entered. Standing in the doorway was a tall man, his posture commanding but not rigid, his presence so striking that even the most unruly children fell quiet without needing to be told. He wore a perfectly tailored light blue suit that caught the sunlight in subtle glints, and his dark hair, carefully styled yet effortlessly natural, contrasted with his piercing blue eyes that seemed almost too vivid to be real. This was Michael Harris, a name most adults in town whispered with awe. To the children, he was simply the mysterious guest they had been told about, the big man from the city, the one who ran a company none of them fully understood but all of them had heard about. Miss Turner quickly rose from her desk, her tone suddenly warmer, more formal than it had been all afternoon. She welcomed him with nervous enthusiasm, gesturing for him to step further into the room. The children's eyes widened, some with admiration, some with suspicion. To them, he didn't look like a man who had time for crayons and paper. He looked like someone who belonged in tall glass buildings, speaking to crowds of important people, not standing in a classroom that smelled faintly of chalk and old wood. Michael, however, did not carry himself with arrogance. As he moved slowly between the rows of desks, His eyes scanned the children's drawings with genuine interest. Castles, rockets, superheroes, animals, he gave each one more than a cursory glance, pausing just long enough for the young artists to hold their breath. For the first time, many of them looked at their work with pride, believing perhaps that what they had scribbled in a rush might actually matter. His calm voice occasionally offered a quiet compliment, a nod, or a thoughtful hum. And then he reached the back of the room, where Lisa sat frozen, her drawing still clutched against the desk as if it were the last piece of safety she had. The faint remnants of laughter still hovered around her, though no one dared repeat it now. Michael stopped, tilting his head as his gaze fell upon the wheelchair and the heart drawn in uneven strokes of red. The silence in the room deepened, and Lisa felt every muscle in her body tense. She expected another round of ridicule, perhaps disguised in politeness. Instead, his expression changed, softening in a way that made him look suddenly younger, almost vulnerable. He crouched slightly so that his eyes were level with Lisa's. For a moment he said nothing, simply studying the lines of the picture as if he were reading a story written between them. The children waited, restless but curious, whispering under their breath. And then, in a voice firm enough to carry across the room but warm enough to leave no doubt of his sincerity, he declared, "This is the best drawing I've seen today. Do you know why? Because it tells the truth. And truth, children, is always more powerful than any laughter." The room shifted as if struck by a sudden wind. The children who had mocked Lisa shrank back in their chairs, eyes darting away. Miss Turner straightened with visible relief, her hands clasped tightly as though she herself had been waiting for someone to say exactly those words. Lisa, wide-eyed, stared at him in disbelief. She had never been defended so openly, never had anyone lift her voice above the laughter on her behalf. Her chest tightened, not with shame this time, but with something fragile and unfamiliar, hope. Michael rose back to his full height, but his gaze lingered on her for a few seconds longer, as though he recognized something beyond the drawing, something that no one else in the room could see. When he finally moved on, Lisa's fingers loosened their grip on the paper. For the first time, she allowed herself to breathe without fear. She didn't know who this man truly was or why he had chosen her drawing to praise, but in that single moment he had turned her humiliation into dignity. And though the other children tried to return to their restlessness, an invisible shift had already taken place. The laughter that once seemed so strong had been silenced, replaced with the quiet authority of a man who had chosen to honor truth over mockery. When the school day finally ended, the children spilled out of the building like a noisy stream, some still buzzing with the excitement of the millionaire's visit, others already forgetting it as they raced each other down the sidewalk. Lisa moved more slowly, clutching her worn backpack against her chest. She had grown used to walking home alone, her small steps tracing the same cracked pavement every afternoon, but today was different. As she lingered by the gate, Michael Harris approached, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the playground. He spoke gently, almost cautiously, asking where she lived and whether he might drive her home. At first, Lisa hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the ground. She had been taught not to trust easily, but something in his tone, calm, steady, and strangely protective, melted her resistance. With a tiny nod, she agreed. The car that waited by the curb gleamed in the sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the curious stares of the remaining children. It was not the sort of car anyone in this neighborhood owned, and Lisa felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she climbed inside. The leather seats were cool beneath her fingers, and for a brief moment she felt out of place, as if she were trespassing in a world not meant for her. Michael noticed her silence and began asking small questions, not the kind adults usually asked out of politeness, but questions that felt genuine: what her favorite subject was, what she liked to draw, whether she had a favorite book. His voice was patient, never pressing when she hesitated, and slowly she found herself answering in soft, cautious words. The city streets gave way to quieter roads as the car rolled farther toward the outskirts. Neat houses with trimmed lawns shifted into older homes with sagging porches and faded paint. Lisa leaned against the window, watching the familiar scenery draw closer, while Michael studied her reflection in the glass. There was something about her manner, about the way she clutched that folded drawing on her lap, that stirred an ache deep within him. He had seen children in every corner of society, from wealthy banquets to charity wards, yet this girl's silence carried a weight far beyond her years. At last, the car slowed before a modest house whose roof bore the scars of too many winters. The wooden steps sagged slightly, and the front yard was dotted with wild grass that grew unchecked. To Michael it was a stark contrast to the world he inhabited, yet the house radiated something he couldn't define, a quiet endurance, perhaps, or the stubborn resilience of lives that refused to be erased. He turned to Lisa with a reassuring smile, but she was already opening the door, her small face brightened with the relief of being home. Then the sound of wheels against wood reached his ears. From the shadow of the porch emerged a woman in a wheelchair, her hands steady on the rims, her posture dignified despite the weight her body carried. Michael's breath caught as though the air had been stolen from him. Time, with its relentless years, seemed to collapse in that instant. Her face was older, touched by lines of struggle, yet the eyes were unmistakable. Eyes he had once known as well as his own, eyes he had dreamed of in lonely nights when success had left him hollow. "Sarah," he whispered, though no one had asked him to speak. Her name broke from him like a confession, trembling with disbelief. The woman's hands faltered on the wheels, and her gaze, startled at first, settled on him with a dawning recognition that stole the strength from her breath. For a heartbeat, neither moved, as if both were caught between past and present, between the shadows of what once was and the reality standing before them. Lisa, oblivious to the storm that had suddenly gathered between her mother and the man beside her, simply looked from one to the other, puzzled by their silence. Michael stood frozen on the path, his polished shoes rooted in the dirt of a life he had long since left behind. Everything around him, the car, the company, the weight of his wealth, seemed to vanish, leaving only the aching truth that he was standing before the woman he had loved and lost, and the child who carried her eyes. Inside the small house, the air was filled with the faint scent of brewed tea and the subtle trace of old wood polished many times over the years. The living room was modest, its furniture slightly worn but carefully kept, with blankets neatly folded across the back of the couch and framed photographs arranged along the mantel. Lisa had disappeared into her room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving the two adults alone with the weight of a silence that felt almost unbearable. Michael stood for a moment near the doorway, unsure whether he was intruding, while Sarah maneuvered her wheelchair to face him fully. The lamplight caught the strands of her hair, now streaked with silver, and for a fleeting instant he saw both the woman she was now and the girl he had once held in his arms. She was the first to speak, her voice steady though tinged with disbelief. She said she had not expected to ever see him again, not after all that time, not after life had carved such a different path for each of them. He took a step forward, but hesitated, his hands tightening as though afraid that if he reached out, she would vanish like a memory too fragile to touch. He whispered that he had thought of her often, more than he cared to admit, and that seeing her face again was like being struck by the past in a way he could neither resist nor prepare for. Sarah's eyes lowered, and with a slow breath she began to explain. The accident had changed everything. In a single moment, her independence, her plans, and the future she had once dreamed with him had crumbled. The hospital stays had been long, the recovery even longer, and when she finally emerged, she was no longer the same woman. Out of pride, and perhaps fear, she had chosen not to reach for him. She could not bear the thought of being pitted or of chaining him to a life of constant struggle. Instead, she had turned away from what they had, believing it was the only way to protect him from the burden she had become. She told him of the years that followed, of a husband who promised devotion but whose patience eroded when the challenges of her condition outweighed his resolve. Eventually he left, unable to withstand the quiet battles of everyday life, and in his absence only her daughter remained. Lisa had become her strength, her companion, her reason to continue despite the loneliness that sometimes pressed on her like a shadow. As she spoke, her words were calm, but Michael could hear the sorrow beneath them, the sorrow of someone who had endured more than most and yet continued to carry herself with dignity. Michael listened in silence, every word cutting deep. He realized with a sharp pang that while he had been building an empire, chasing deals, and surrounding himself with wealth, she had been fighting battles he had never even known existed. He felt ashamed for not searching harder, for letting the past drift away without demanding to know why. He confessed that all the power and success he had achieved had left him empty, that none of it had filled the space she had left behind. His voice broke slightly as he admitted that she had been the one person he had truly loved, and though he had buried that truth beneath years of ambition, standing here now made it impossible to deny. The room felt charged with unspoken memories, the echo of laughter long ago, the dreams of a life that might have been. Sarah's eyes glistened, though she refused to let tears fall, and she said she had often wondered if he had forgotten her entirely. Michael shook his head, almost fiercely, insisting that forgetting had never been possible, not for a single day. For a moment, the years between them seemed to dissolve, and all that remained was the aching recognition that despite everything, despite her wheelchair, despite his empire, despite the choices that had pulled them apart, their bond had never truly broken. Outside, Lisa sat quietly in her room, holding the drawing that had caused so much laughter earlier. She pressed it to her chest without knowing that in the other room, the very truth she had drawn was being spoken aloud, piece by piece, as two lives collided once again in a way neither had expected. The weeks that followed their unexpected reunion moved with a strange rhythm, carrying both an air of quiet discovery and a sense of looming tension that neither Sarah nor Michael could quite name. Michael began to visit more often, sometimes bringing small gifts for Lisa, a set of colored pencils, a book filled with stories of brave girls who overcame impossible odds, but he never arrived empty-handed for Sarah either. For her, he brought flowers from the city, delicacies she had long forgotten the taste of, and more importantly, his time. He would sit across from her, listening with an intensity that reminded her of the man she had once loved, and though she tried to remain guarded, there were moments when her eyes softened, betraying feelings she could not entirely conceal. Yet beneath this fragile renewal, shadows gathered, and soon Michael discovered a threat that made his chest tighten with dread. It began with an ordinary meeting at his corporate headquarters, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that seemed to mock the modest home he had come to know so well. The boardroom was filled with sharp suits, polished shoes, and the restless hunger of men who measured success only in numbers. A proposal lay before them, bold and aggressive, the acquisition of a large piece of land on the outskirts of town, an area that was to be cleared and repurposed for a sprawling development project. The presentation was sleek, filled with graphs, projections, and promises of astronomical profit. At first, Michael barely registered it, distracted by the thought of Lisa's shy smile and the sound of Sarah's laughter when she allowed herself to forget her burdens. But then, as the maps came into focus, he recognized the location with startling clarity. The parcel of land targeted for demolition was the very ground on which Sarah's house stood. His pulse quickened, and he sat back in his chair, eyes narrowing as the presenter spoke of unnecessary dwellings and low-value properties that would be swept aside to make room for luxury housing. No one in the room considered the families who lived there, the stories tied to those walls, or the fact that one of those homes sheltered the woman Michael had once promised forever to. As the discussion grew more animated, his silence did not go unnoticed. When he finally raised his voice, questioning whether such displacement was ethical, the room shifted uncomfortably, as though ethics were a foreign language. His words were brushed aside with dismissive chuckles, assurances that this was standard practice, nothing personal. But to him, it was personal in every possible way. The true blow came when he learned who had spearheaded the project. Across the table sat Jonathan Pierce, his closest partner, a man he had trusted for years, a man whose sharp mind and ruthless ambition had helped build the empire they both commanded. Jonathan spoke of the deal with barely contained excitement, describing the profit margins as if they were golden treasures waiting to be unearthed. His confidence, his smirk, his absolute indifference to the lives that would be uprooted, all of it ignited something dark in Michael's chest. He realized that while he had always known Jonathan was ambitious, he had never seen how easily that ambition could consume compassion entirely. When the meeting adjourned, Michael lingered in the hallway, staring out at the glittering city skyline that had once been his pride. He thought of Sarah's fragile dignity, of the way her hands gripped the wheels of her chair as she maneuvered across her small porch. He thought of Lisa's voice when she spoke softly about her mother, always with an undercurrent of fierce loyalty. The idea of their home being bulldozed into rubble made his stomach twist with rage. For the first time, he questioned not just the deal, but the very foundation of the empire he had spent his life constructing. Over the following days, the pressure only grew. Jonathan cornered him in his office, speaking of investors and deadlines, insisting that hesitation would cost them millions. Other board members echoed the same sentiment, their voices sharp and impatient, painting him as an obstacle to progress. Yet Michael could not bring himself to agree, and the more they pushed, the more his resistance hardened. He knew what it meant to defy them, knew the consequences could ripple through the company like a storm, yet every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face illuminated by lamplight, proud even in her suffering, and Lisa's small hands clutching that crumpled drawing as though it were her shield. The realization struck him with undeniable force: if he chose to side with the company, he would lose far more than he gained. He would be betraying not only Sarah and Lisa, but also the last remnants of the man he once believed himself to be. The battle was no longer about contracts or profits, it had become a test of loyalty, of love, and of the values he had allowed success to erode. In that moment, Michael Harris understood that he was about to fight the most difficult war of his life, not in boardrooms filled with charts and numbers, but in the silent places of his own heart, where truth demanded he stand against the very empire he had built. The storm began quietly, almost invisibly, like the subtle shift of wind before a hurricane. At first it was nothing more than murmurs in the boardroom, sharp glances exchanged when Michael voiced his objections, the faint but unmistakable tone of irritation when Jonathan pressed him yet again for approval. But those murmurs grew, gaining strength, until they thundered in newspapers and stockholder meetings, until they rattled even the walls of his own office. For the first time in years, Michael Harris was no longer seen as the unshakable leader of his empire but as a man standing in open defiance of the very machine he had spent a lifetime building. The board of directors convened emergency sessions, their words slicing through the room like blades. They accused him of jeopardizing the company's future, of allowing sentimentality to cloud judgment, of risking not only his fortune but theirs. Jonathan's voice rose above the rest, sharp and venomous, painting Michael as reckless, irresponsible, and dangerously close to destroying everything they had achieved together. He pointed to plummeting numbers on charts projected across the wall, the red arrows sinking lower each day as investors panicked. "You're ruining us," Jonathan said, his face twisted with fury. "And for what? For a crumbling house and a woman in a wheelchair." The cruelty of the word struck like a blow, but Michael did not flinch. His silence, calm yet unyielding, was his only reply. Beyond the corporate walls, the chaos was no less severe. Newspapers published headlines questioning his judgment, television analysts debated whether the great Michael Harris had finally lost his mind, and whispers spread through the city that the empire was collapsing. Once admiring allies avoided him at parties and receptions, their smiles strained, their loyalty vanishing as quickly as the value of their shares. In the world of power, loyalty was never unconditional, it was purchased by success and abandoned in failure. Michael, once at the very peak of admiration, now found himself an island of resistance in a sea of scorn. Yet amid the fury, he discovered something he had long forgotten: clarity. Each night, when the noise of the day had faded, he drove out of the city to that modest house on the outskirts, where no one cared about his titles or the worth of his stocks. Sarah would greet him at the door, her dignity unbroken despite the struggles carved into her life, and Lisa would run to him with her drawings, eager to show the world she created with her colored pencils. In those quiet evenings, the weight of headlines and accusations seemed to dissolve. For the first time in decades, he remembered why life had meaning at all. Still, the battle took its toll. He returned each morning to boardrooms filled with venom and betrayal, to phone calls that demanded his resignation, to men he had once trusted plotting openly against him. Jonathan grew more ruthless with every passing day, summoning investors to his side, painting Michael as an aging fool whose heart had grown soft. It became clear that the fight was no longer just about the land or the house, it was about control, about whether Michael Harris still had the strength to stand against a tide determined to erase him. And stand he did. He refused to sign the contracts, vetoed proposals, and blocked attempts to push the deal forward. Each decision was like a spark dropped into oil, igniting outrage, yet he remained firm. The fury of his colleagues was deafening, but his conviction had grown stronger than their threats. He knew exactly what was at stake. To the board, it was millions in profit. To him, it was Sarah's home, Lisa's sanctuary, and perhaps the last chance to reclaim the man he had once been. The empire shook, its pillars cracking under the strain of the war between heart and greed, but Michael no longer feared collapse. He had lived for too long in the shadow of wealth that brought no peace. Now, even as the world called him mad, he felt for the first time in years that he was standing on solid ground. The storm raged louder with every passing day, yet somewhere deep within him, a quiet strength had awakened, a strength born not of power or money but of love and loyalty. It was a strength his enemies could not measure, and though they had numbers and charts and influence, they did not have what he had, the truth of his own soul. It was a quiet evening when the weight of the conflict seemed to settle most heavily on Michael's shoulders. He had returned from the city exhausted, his suit jacket tossed carelessly across the arm of the chair, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed with the fatigue of another day spent battling men who once called themselves allies. The television in the corner had been broadcasting yet another segment questioning his leadership, the sound muted but the moving captions sharp enough to wound. Sarah, sensing his weariness, had said little, offering him only the comfort of her steady presence as she brewed tea and placed it in front of him. Lisa, who had been coloring on the floor with her pencils scattered like tiny sticks of hope, noticed the heaviness in his expression and set down her work. She studied him with the curious seriousness only a child could possess, and after a long pause, she climbed onto the couch beside him, holding one of her drawings tightly in her hands. The drawing was simple yet filled with the same honesty that had first caught his attention back at the school. It showed her mother in her wheelchair again, but this time she was not alone. Beside her, Lisa had drawn a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a smile on his face. Over both of them floated a large red heart, bold and imperfect but pulsing with unmistakable meaning. Michael looked at it, his throat tightening as though the paper itself had pressed against his chest. He turned to Lisa, his voice soft, asking who the man was. Without hesitation, she answered that it was someone who would love her mother for who she was, someone who would never let them be alone. Her words were not said with childish playfulness but with quiet certainty, as if she had carried the thought for a long time before daring to give it voice. Michael sat frozen, the drawing trembling slightly in his hands, and when he looked back at Lisa's clear blue eyes, he saw that she meant every word. For her, this was not imagination or fantasy, it was hope, distilled into crayon lines and spoken aloud with the kind of courage adults often lose. She was not asking him directly, not demanding anything, yet the unspoken truth hung heavily in the room. Sarah, sitting nearby, heard her daughter's words and lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening on the arms of her chair. She tried to intervene, to soften the moment with a gentle laugh or a change of subject, but her voice failed her. Something about the intensity in Michael's expression, the way he clutched the paper as if it held his entire future, stopped her. For years she had told herself that love was behind her, that her duty was only to raise her daughter and endure quietly, but in that moment she realized that the child had seen what she herself had been too afraid to admit. Michael could not speak at first, overwhelmed by the clarity of what had just been revealed to him. All the battles in boardrooms, the headlines in newspapers, the accusations of betrayal, all of it seemed to fade against the simplicity of Lisa's belief. He understood then, with a force that made his heart ache, that her picture was more than a child's wish. It was prophecy, a vision drawn from love so pure it could not be denied. The man beside Sarah was not an invention. It was him. She had already placed him there in her world, quietly, instinctively, as though she had always known he belonged. The realization shook him more deeply than any loss of fortune ever could. He saw with painful clarity that the empire he was fighting to protect or dismantle was insignificant compared to this fragile family who had somehow reopened the part of him he thought had died long ago. He looked from Lisa to Sarah, and though words still eluded him, his silence was not empty. It was full, brimming with promise, with the weight of decisions made and paths chosen. Lisa smiled then, the kind of small, secret smile that children wear when they know something adults are too slow to understand. She leaned against him for a moment before slipping down from the couch, leaving the drawing in his hands. As she disappeared into her room, the paper remained, resting against his chest like a vow unspoken but already binding. For the first time in years, Michael felt the certainty of a truth larger than ambition or wealth. He was not fighting for numbers on a screen or for his own pride. He was fighting because a child had drawn him into her heart and trusted him to stay there. The collapse of the deal came like the final crack of thunder after a long storm, sudden yet inevitable. The negotiations that had once been paraded as the company's next great triumph disintegrated when Michael refused to yield, and with his resistance the entire structure of promises and projections toppled. Investors pulled back, stock prices dipped further, and the newspapers declared the fall of a man who had once been untouchable. Yet as the financial world seethed and judged him with unforgiving precision, Michael felt something he had not felt in decades: relief. The empire he had built still stood, though weakened, but for the first time he no longer feared the idea of it crumbling entirely, because what mattered most was no longer confined to those glass towers or those endless meetings. In the quiet aftermath, he drove again to the outskirts of the city, his sleek car pulling up before the modest house that had become both a refuge and a battlefield for his heart. The porch light glowed faintly in the evening haze, and there, framed by the soft golden spill of the lamp, sat Sarah in her wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap, her expression serene but cautious as though she still expected the world to find some way to take this peace from her. Lisa darted in and out of the doorway behind her, full of restless energy, showing her mother something she had drawn before rushing back inside again. The house, humble as it was, radiated warmth, and as Michael stepped out of the car, he realized that this was what home had always meant, though he had spent years trying to replace it with marble floors and penthouse views. He walked up the worn steps slowly, as if crossing into a sacred space, and when Sarah looked up at him their eyes locked with the weight of all that had been lost and all that still might be reclaimed. He sat beside her, not speaking at first, letting the silence settle between them until it no longer felt heavy but necessary. Finally, he told her everything, that he had chosen her home over his empire, that the world might call him reckless or foolish, but he had never felt more certain of a choice in his life. He admitted that he had been afraid, not of losing money, but of losing her again, of letting her slip away while he drowned in the noise of ambition. His voice trembled when he confessed that he had loved her still, through every year apart, and that seeing her now, even in her struggles, had reminded him that love did not diminish with time or circumstance, it only waited, quietly, for courage to return. Sarah listened, her expression unreadable at first, her hands tightening against the arms of her chair. For so long she had braced herself against disappointment, had told herself that love was a chapter closed, that survival was all that remained. But as she looked at him, as she heard the raw honesty in his voice, she felt the fragile walls she had built begin to crack. She whispered that she had thought of him too, countless nights when the loneliness was too much to bear, but she had convinced herself he belonged to a world of power and light far removed from hers. She admitted that she had been wrong, that perhaps the mistake was not in loving him but in underestimating the depth of what they had once shared. Lisa appeared then, stepping softly onto the porch, her drawing clutched tightly in her hands. She hesitated at the sight of them, then shyly placed the paper on her mother's lap. It was the same picture she had shown Michael before, but now she had added something new, a house drawn behind the figures, small and crooked but filled with bright yellow light in every window. Above it, the heart glowed larger than ever, as though the crayon itself had been pressed harder in her conviction. She looked at them both, her face radiant with the certainty of a child who believes in miracles. Neither Sarah nor Michael could find the words, but they didn't need to. The drawing said everything. From that night forward, life did not become suddenly easy, but it became different in ways that mattered. Michael invested not in towers of glass but in projects that brought dignity to people like Sarah, funding programs for those who lived with disabilities, creating opportunities where there had once been only obstacles. His name still appeared in newspapers, but now alongside stories of generosity rather than scandal. And in the quiet spaces of his personal life, he found a happiness wealth had never granted him. Sarah's laughter returned, tentative at first but growing more confident, as though each day peeled away another layer of sorrow. Lisa flourished, her drawings filling the house with color and hope, her smile lighting up rooms brighter than any chandelier in the city. One morning, as the sun spilled across the porch and the world beyond stirred with the sounds of another busy day, Michael sat beside Sarah, their hands entwined. He looked at her, and without hesitation, he told her that he had lost her once but would never allow it to happen again. For a moment, she said nothing, but the smile that curved her lips was answer enough. Lisa, watching from the doorway, pressed her old drawing to her chest and thought with the quiet certainty of a child who knows she was right all along. Sometimes the truth drawn in crayon was stronger than the plans written in ink.